The whispers followed Frances Donovan like a shadow as she walked down the dusty main street of Camp Verde, Arizona, in the scorching summer of 1879. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, clutching her basket of groceries tighter to her chest as Widow Jenkins and her gossiping companions huddled together, their voices deliberately loud enough for her to hear. "Poor Edwin Jameson," Widow Jenkins said with exaggerated sympathy. "Married 5 years to that woman and not a single child to show for it. What use is she as a wife?" Frances quickened her pace, the familiar ache spreading through her chest. At 26, she had endured the town's judgment for years now. After her miscarriages, 3 painful losses that had nearly broken her, the whispers had started. When no more pregnancies followed, the whispers turned to open mockery. The mercantile's bell jingled as Frances pushed open the door, hoping to escape the heat and the hurtful words. Mr. Peterson glanced up from behind the counter, his expression softening with pity when he saw her. "Afternoon, Mrs. Jameson," he said, nodding politely. "Afternoon, Mr. Peterson. I need some flour and sugar, please." Frances kept her voice steady, refusing to show how much the town's treatment wounded her. As Mr. Peterson gathered her items, the door opened again, bringing with it a blast of hot air and the sound of spurs jingling against wooden floorboards. Frances didn't turn around, keeping her attention on the jars of preserves on the shelf before her. "Mornin', Peterson," a deep, unfamiliar voice said. "Just rode in from Prescott, looking to stock up before heading to the Jameson Ranch." Frances stiffened at the mention of her husband's name. Edwin had mentioned hiring a new ranch hand to help with the expanding cattle operation, but she hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. "You must be Elliot Jakes," Mr. Peterson said. "Edwin mentioned you'd be coming. This here is Mrs. Jameson, his wife." Frances turned reluctantly, finding herself face to face with a tall man in his early 30s, his skin bronzed by the sun and his dark blonde hair peeking out beneath a well-worn hat. His blue eyes met hers directly, showing none of the usual discomfort or pity she had grown accustomed to seeing. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Elliot Jakes. Your husband saved my hide in a nasty situation down in Tucson last month. When he offered me work, I couldn't refuse." "Mr. Jakes," Frances acknowledged with a nod. "Edwin didn't mention when you'd be arriving." "Meant to be here next week, but circumstances changed." His gaze flickered briefly to her empty basket. "Let me help you with your supplies, madam." Before she could protest, Elliot had taken the heavy bag of flour from Mr. Peterson's hands and collected the sugar and other items she needed. His easy confidence was unlike anything Frances had encountered in Camp Verde, where most men either openly scorned her or avoided her gaze entirely. As they left the store together, Frances was acutely aware of Widow Jenkins and her friends watching from across the street, their heads bent together in fresh gossip. She walked faster, eager to reach her wagon and escape their scrutiny. "Don't mind them," Elliot said quietly, falling into step beside her. "Small-town folk always need something to talk about." "You don't know what they're saying," Frances replied, her voice tight. "Don't need to," he said. "Seen enough small towns to recognize the look of people with nothing better to do than tear others down." They reached her wagon, and Elliot loaded her supplies in the back before offering his hand to help her up to the seat. Frances hesitated before accepting, unused to such courtesy from anyone other than her husband. "I'll follow behind on my horse," he said, stepping back. "Don't know the way to the ranch yet." Frances nodded, picking up the reins. "It's about 5 miles west of town. Just follow this road until you see the split-rail fence with the J branded on the gatepost." As she guided the wagon out of town, Frances could feel the stares burning into her back. For 5 years, She had endured the town's cruelty, each day harder than the last. Edwin had been patient and kind, never blaming her for their childlessness, but she had seen the longing in his eyes when they passed families with children. The 5-mile journey passed in silence, with Elliot trailing behind on his chestnut gelding. When they reached the modest ranch house, Edwin was waiting on the porch, his tall frame silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "There you are," he called, coming down the steps to help Frances from the wagon. "I see you've met Elliot." "In town," Frances confirmed, accepting her husband's hand. "Mr. Peterson introduced us." Edwin clapped Elliot on the shoulder. "Glad you made it early. We've got a situation with the north pasture fence that could use an extra pair of hands." Frances left the men to their work, carrying her purchases into the house. The Jameson Ranch wasn't the largest in the territory, but Edwin had built it from nothing after coming west from Pennsylvania 10 years ago. The house was simple but comfortable, with 3 bedrooms, one they used, one for guests, and one that remained painfully empty. That evening, Frances prepared a hearty meal for the men, listening to their conversation about cattle prices and water rights. Elliot spoke little about himself, only mentioning that he'd been working ranches across the territory for the past decade. "Where are you from originally?" Frances asked as she served apple pie for dessert. "Kentucky," Elliot replied. "Left home at 18, been wandering ever since." "No family?" Edwin asked. Elliot's expression remained neutral. "None to speak of." The conversation shifted, but Frances found herself studying their new ranch hand when he wasn't looking. There was something about him, a quiet dignity, perhaps, that set him apart from the other men in Camp Verde. Over the next few weeks, Elliot proved himself to be an exceptional worker. He rose before dawn and often worked past sunset, helping to repair fences, move cattle, and build a new storage shed. Edwin was clearly pleased with the decision to hire him. Frances, too, found herself appreciating Elliot's presence. Unlike the other ranch hands Edwin had hired in the past, Elliot always thanked her for meals, cleaned his boots before entering the house, and occasionally brought wildflowers he'd found while riding the range. "These were growing by the creek," he said one evening, handing her a small bunch of vibrant purple blossoms. "Seemed a shame to leave them where no one would see them." Frances had been startled by the gesture, nearly dropping the flowers in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Jakes." "Elliot, please," he said. "Mr. Jakes was my father, and I'd rather not be reminded of him." The mention of his father brought a shadow across his face, and Frances wondered about the story behind it but didn't press. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep hidden. Summer turned to early fall, and with the change in seasons came news that the Camp Verde Harvest Festival would soon be held. Frances had avoided the event in previous years, unwilling to subject herself to the town's scrutiny, but Edwin was eager to attend. "We should go this year," he said at breakfast. "We've had a good season with the cattle, time for a little celebration." Frances focused on pouring coffee. "You should go, I have plenty to do here." Edwin frowned. "Frances, you can't keep hiding from the town." "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I simply have no desire to be the object of their pity and mockery." Elliot cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence at the table. "Pardon me for speaking out of turn, but I'd be happy to escort Mrs. Jameson to the festival if you're busy with other matters, Edwin." Edwin looked surprised, then thoughtful. "That's not a bad idea. I do need to meet with Peterson about those cattle we're selling next month." He turned to Frances. "What do you say? Elliot can keep you company, and I'll join you later." Trapped, Frances reluctantly agreed, though the thought of facing the town filled her with dread. The day of the festival arrived clear and crisp. Frances put on her best dress, a deep blue calico that Edwin had bought for her last Christmas, and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat arrangement. As she fastened a simple silver locket around her neck, a wedding gift from Edwin, she caught sight of Elliot through the window, readying the wagon. Unlike his usual work clothes, he wore a clean shirt and vest, his hair combed neatly beneath his hat. He looked, Frances had to admit, quite handsome. The ride to town was mostly silent, with Frances growing increasingly tense as they approached Camp Verde. Elliot seemed to sense her anxiety, keeping conversation light and pointing out interesting sights along the way. "Beautiful country," he remarked as they passed a stand of cottonwoods. "I've been all over the territory, but there's something special about this valley." "It is beautiful," Frances agreed, grateful for the distraction. As they reached the outskirts of town, Elliot slowed the wagon. "Mrs. James and Frances, I want you to know something before we arrive." She turned to him, surprised by his use of her first name. "Whatever these people say or think about you doesn't matter one bit," he said, his blue eyes serious. "Their opinions aren't worth the breath it takes to speak them." Frances felt a lump form in her throat. "You don't understand. I understand more than you might think," he interrupted gently. "I've been judged plenty in my life. Learned the hard way that the only opinions that matter are those of people who truly know you." Before she could respond, they had arrived at the town square, where colorful bunting and tables laden with food created a festive atmosphere. Families mingled, children ran playing between stalls, and a small band played lively tunes near a cleared area for dancing. As Frances climbed down from the wagon, she felt the familiar sensation of eyes turning in her direction. Widow Jenkins and her friends were seated near the punch bowl, their gazes sharp as hawks as they watched Elliot offer his arm to Frances. "Would you care for some refreshment?" Elliot asked, seemingly oblivious to the attention they were receiving. Frances nodded, allowing him to lead her toward the food tables. As they walked, she heard the whispers start. Still not with child after all these years. Poor Edwin, stuck with a barren wife. Who's that man with her? Not proper for her to be here without her husband. Elliot's hand suddenly covered hers where it rested on his arm, giving a gentle squeeze. "Ignore them," he murmured. They collected plates of food and found a table at the edge of the gathering. Frances picked at her meal, her appetite gone, while Elliot ate heartily and kept up a steady stream of conversation about his travels across the territory. "Ever been to the Grand Canyon?" he asked between bites of fried chicken. Frances shook her head. "Edwin talks about taking me someday, but the ranch keeps us busy." "It's a sight worth seeing," Elliot said. "Makes a man feel mighty small, standing at the edge of something so vast and ancient." As he described the magnificent views, Frances found herself momentarily forgetting her discomfort. Elliot had a way of painting pictures with words, bringing to life places she had only read about in books. Their conversation was interrupted by Mayor Williams, a portly man with an impressive mustache, who approached their table with his wife in tow. "Mrs. Jameson," he greeted, his voice overly loud. "Surprised to see you here. Where's Edwin?" "He'll be joining us later," Frances replied politely. "This is Elliot Jakes, our new ranch hand." The mayor barely acknowledged Elliot before continuing. "My Sarah here just had our sixth child last month." A strapping boy, nearly 10 pounds. "The Williamses are known for our fertile bloodlines." His wife had the grace to look embarrassed, but the mayor seemed oblivious to the cruelty of his words. Frances felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Before she could respond, Elliot stood, his full height towering over the mayor. "Mrs. Jameson was just telling me about the fine education she received back east. Reads Latin and Greek, I hear. Remarkable accomplishment." He turned to Frances. I believe you promised to show me that quilt display you mentioned. Grateful for the rescue, Frances rose and allowed Elliot to lead her away. Once they were out of earshot, she let out a shaky breath. Thank you. Man's a fool, Elliot said simply. Now, is there really a quilt display? I've developed a sudden interest in needlework. The unexpected humor startled a laugh from Frances, her first genuine laugh in longer than she could remember. There is, actually, this way. They spent the next hour examining the handiwork of Camp Verde's women, with Elliot offering comically serious opinions on patterns and stitching that kept Frances smiling despite herself. When the band struck up a lively reel, he turned to her with raised eyebrows. Would you care to dance, Mrs. Jameson? Frances hesitated. I don't think just one dance, he insisted. Then we can leave if you wish. Against her better judgment, Frances allowed him to lead her to the dance area. As they joined the other couples, she felt the stares intensify, but Elliot's steady presence kept her grounded. He was a surprisingly good dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence. Where did you learn to dance? She asked as they circled each other. My mother insisted, he replied. Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo. As the music continued, Frances gradually relaxed, focusing on the rhythm and Elliot's lead rather than the watching townspeople. When the song ended, another began immediately and without discussion. They continued dancing. By the third dance, Frances was flushed and smiling, caught up in the music and movement. Elliot watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his blue eyes never leaving her face. When they finally stepped away from the dance floor, Frances realized that Edwin had arrived and was watching them from near the entrance to the square. She felt a momentary guilt, as if she'd been caught doing something improper, though she knew there was nothing wrong with dancing at a public festival. Edwin approached, nodding to Elliot. Looks like you two are enjoying yourselves. Your wife is an excellent dancer, Elliot said, stepping back respectfully. Edwin smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. She is indeed. I need to speak with Peterson. Would you mind getting Frances some punch? She looks thirsty. As Elliot left to fetch refreshments, Edwin turned to Frances. You look different today. Different how? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Happy, he said simply. It's been a while since I've seen you smile like that. Before she could respond, Edwin was called away by Mr. Peterson, leaving Frances alone until Elliot returned with 2 cups of punch. Everything all right? He asked, handing her a cup. Yes, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Something had shifted today, but she couldn't put a name to it. The remainder of the festival passed more pleasantly than Frances could have imagined. Edwin was busy with business discussions for much of the afternoon, leaving Elliot to escort her through the various displays and activities. To her surprise, she found herself enjoying the day, Elliot's steady presence acting as a buffer against the town's judgment. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the square, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. The band began playing slower, more romantic tunes, and couples moved closer together on the dance floor. Edwin approached them, looking tired but satisfied. Peterson's agreed to our price for the cattle. Good day's work. He glanced at the dancers, then at Frances. Would you like to dance, my dear? Actually, Frances said, I'm rather tired. Perhaps we could head home. Edwin nodded, clearly disappointed but accepting. Of course. Let me just say goodbye to the mayor and we can go. As he walked away, Elliot turned to Frances. You didn't have to cut your evening short on my account. It's not that, she assured him. I've had a lovely time, but I've had enough of being the center of attention for one day. Elliot studied her face in the lantern light. For what it's worth, I think you've shown remarkable grace today. Not many could face what you have with such dignity. His words warmed her in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. "Thank you for your company, Elliot. It made today bearable." "It was my pleasure, Francis," he replied, his voice soft. The drive home was quiet, with Edwin at the reins and Elliot following behind on his horse. Frances found herself lost in thoughts of the day, the dancing, the conversations with Elliot, the way he had defended her against the mayor's thoughtlessness. When they arrived at the ranch, Edwin went directly to check on a mare that was close to foaling, leaving Frances and Elliot at the house. "Thank you again for today," Frances said as she prepared to go inside. Elliot removed his hat, holding it against his chest. "I should be thanking you. Best festival I've attended in years." Their eyes met for a moment too long before Frances looked away. "Good night, Elliot." "Good night, Frances," he replied, his voice carrying on the cool evening air as she closed the door behind her. That night, lying beside Edwin in their bed, Frances found herself unable to sleep. Her mind kept returning to the festival, to the feeling of Elliot's hand at her waist as they danced, to the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. It was wrong to think such thoughts, she knew. Edwin was a good husband, kind, hardworking, and patient, despite the disappointment of their childless marriage. He didn't deserve a wife whose thoughts strayed to another man. Frances turned onto her side, watching Edwin's profile in the moonlight that filtered through the window. He had been her savior once, offering marriage when her father died suddenly, leaving her penniless and alone. She had grown to love him over time, comfortable in the quiet partnership they had built. But something had awakened in her today, a feeling she had thought long buried beneath years of shame and disappointment. And that frightened her more than all the gossip and cruelty Camp Verde could offer. The weeks that followed the festival brought changes to the Jameson ranch. Edwin, encouraged by the successful cattle sale, began making plans to expand their operation, spending long days riding the range and meeting with neighboring ranchers. Frances found herself increasingly in Elliot's company, as he often stayed behind to work on projects closer to the house while Edwin was away. Though she tried to maintain a proper distance, their conversations grew longer and more personal. One crisp October morning, as Frances hung laundry on the line behind the house, Elliot approached with an armful of firewood. "Morning, Mrs. Jameson," he said, setting down his load. "Thought you might need more wood for the stove. Weather's turning cooler." "Thank you," she replied, pinning one of Edwin's shirts to the line. "Though I've asked you to call me Francis when we're not in company," he smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Old habits. My mother was strict about propriety." "Tell me about her," Frances said, realizing how little she knew about his past. Elliot leaned against the woodpile, his expression softening. "She was a schoolteacher before she married. Smart as a whip and twice as sharp when crossed. Taught me to read and write, to appreciate poetry and music." His smile faded. "She died when I was 16. Fever took her in less than a week." "I'm sorry," Frances said softly. "And your father," a hardness entered Elliot's eyes. "Mean drunk, beat me when the mood struck him. After she died, he got worse. I left 2 years later, never looked back." Frances stopped her work, moved by the pain evident in his voice. "That must have been terribly difficult." "Life's difficult for most folks," he said with a shrug. "I've managed. What about your family?" Frances resumed hanging the laundry, using the task to avoid his gaze. "My mother died when I was young. My father was a banker in St. Louis. He raised me alone, made sure I had an education. When he died of heart failure, I had nowhere to go. Edwin had been doing business with him, offered to marry me and bring me west." She paused. "It was a kindness I didn't expect." "Was it a love match?" Elliot asked, then immediately shook his head. "Forgive me, that's not my business." "No, it wasn't," Frances admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. "Not at first, but Edwin has been good to me, especially when—" She trailed off, unwilling to speak of her failures as a wife. Elliot stepped closer, helping her hang a sheet that had started to blow in the strengthening breeze. "When the children didn't come?" he asked gently. Frances froze, then nodded, her throat tight. "3 miscarriages in our first 2 years of marriage, nothing since." She hadn't spoken of this to anyone other than Edwin and the doctor. "The town believes I'm barren. Useless." "The town is wrong," Elliot said with unexpected vehemence. "A woman's worth isn't measured by the children she bears." His words, so different from everything she'd heard in Camp Verde, brought tears to her eyes. Frances turned away, embarrassed by her emotional response. "Frances," Elliot said, his voice low, "look at me." Reluctantly, she faced him, aware of how close they were standing, of the sheet hanging between them like a flimsy barrier. "You are wanted," he said simply. "Your kindness, your intelligence, your strength, these things have value beyond any child you might have borne." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment, Frances thought he might reach for her, and worse, that she might let him. Instead, he stepped back, breaking the tension between them. "I should finish splitting that wood," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Edwin mentioned wanting to fix the north corral today." Frances nodded, unable to trust her voice. As she watched him walk away, she pressed a hand to her racing heart, frightened by the feelings he stirred in her. That evening at dinner, Edwin announced his plans to travel to Phoenix for a week to arrange the purchase of new breeding stock. "I'll leave day after tomorrow," he said, serving himself more potatoes. "Elliot, I'll need you to keep things running here." "Of course," Elliot replied, his gaze carefully avoiding Frances. "I could come with you," Frances offered, suddenly desperate to put distance between herself and Elliot. Edwin looked surprised. "You hate long journeys, and the accommodations in Phoenix aren't what you're used to. Besides, someone needs to keep the house." The decision made, Frances spent the next day helping Edwin prepare for his trip, packing food and clean clothes, all the while acutely aware of Elliot working outside. The morning of Edwin's departure brought heavy clouds and a chill wind from the north. As he mounted his horse, Edwin pulled Frances close for a goodbye kiss. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised. "Don't worry about anything here. Elliot will take care of whatever needs doing." Frances nodded, forcing a smile. "Safe travels." As Edwin rode away, Frances felt a growing sense of apprehension. A week alone with Elliot stretched before her, full of danger she couldn't name. The first 2 days passed without incident, with Frances keeping to the house and Elliot working from dawn to dusk on ranch chores. They shared meals in near silence, both seemingly determined to maintain a proper distance. On the 3rd day, rain began to fall, a steady downpour that turned the ranch yard to mud and kept Elliot closer to the house than usual. By late afternoon, with no sign of the rain letting up, he appeared at the kitchen door, soaked to the skin. "Sorry to disturb you," he said, water dripping from his hat onto the floor. "The roof of the storage shed is leaking badly. Need to move some supplies to the barn before they're ruined." "Of course," Frances said, setting aside the bread she'd been kneading. "Do you need help? I can manage," he started to say, but a crash of thunder made him glance outside with concern. "Actually, an extra pair of hands would be welcome if you don't mind the weather." Frances grabbed an oilcloth coat from the peg by the door and followed Elliot into the rain. They ran to the storage shed, where water was indeed pouring through a section of damaged roof onto sacks of grain and other supplies. Working together, they moved the most vulnerable items to the barn, making trip after trip through the downpour. By the time they finished, both were thoroughly soaked despite their protective clothing. "We should get inside," Elliot shouted over another roll of thunder. "Storm's getting worse." They hurried to the house, where Frances immediately stoked the fire in the kitchen stove. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before you catch your death," she told Elliot. "I'll make some coffee." He nodded gratefully and disappeared to his small room off the barn to change. When he returned, wearing dry clothes but with his hair still damp, Frances had coffee and stew warming on the stove. "The rain's good for the land," he said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. "But I'm worried about that creek that runs behind the property. It floods easily." "Edwin mentioned that," Frances said, stirring the stew. "There's a marker he checks when heavy rains come." Elliot nodded. "I checked it earlier. Water's rising fast." He took a sip of coffee. "I should look again after we eat." They ate dinner at the kitchen table, listening to the rain hammer against the roof and windows. The wind had picked up, howling around the corners of the house and rattling the shutters. As Frances cleared their plates, Elliot stood. "I'll check that creek now. If it's overflowing its banks, we might need to move the horses to higher ground." "Be careful," Frances said, concern evident in her voice. He gave her a reassuring smile. "Always am." The minutes stretched into an hour, then two, with no sign of Elliot returning. Frances paced the kitchen, growing increasingly worried as the storm raged outside. Finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, she donned the oilcloth coat again and lit a lantern. The rain hit her like needles as she stepped outside, the wind threatening to tear the coat from her body. Frances held the lantern high, calling Elliot's name as she made her way toward the creek. The roar of rushing water reached her before she saw it. The normally placid creek had transformed into a raging torrent, overflowing its banks and flooding the lower pasture. In the dim light of the lantern, she could see debris being swept downstream at frightening speed. "Elliot," she called again, desperation creeping into her voice. A faint answering shout came from her left, and Frances turned to see Elliot struggling through floodwaters near a fallen tree. As she watched in horror, he lost his footing and disappeared beneath the surging water. Without thinking, Frances ran along the bank, keeping her lantern high to track where Elliot had gone under. She spotted him several yards downstream, clinging to a partially submerged branch, the current threatening to tear him away at any moment. "Hold on," she shouted, searching frantically for a way to reach him. A length of rope hung on a post nearby, part of a fence Edwin had been repairing. Frances grabbed it and tied one end around her waist, securing the other to a sturdy tree. Then, taking a deep breath, she waded into the freezing floodwaters. The current immediately tried to sweep her away, but the rope held firm as she fought her way toward Elliot. When she reached him, his grip on the branch was weakening, his face pale in the lantern light she had set on the bank. "Take my hand," she cried, stretching toward him. His fingers closed around hers with surprising strength, and Frances pulled with all her might, using the rope to brace herself against the current. Inch by painful inch, they made their way back to shallower water, finally collapsing on the muddy bank, gasping for breath. "What were you thinking?" Elliot demanded when he could speak, his voice hoarse. "You could have been killed, so could you?" Frances retorted, shivering violently in her sodden clothes. "I couldn't just let you drown." Elliot stared at her for a long moment, then his expression softened. "Thank you," he said simply. Not many would have risked that. Together they struggled back to the house, leaning on each other for support against the howling wind. Once inside, Frances built up the fire while Elliot changed into dry clothes again, returning with blankets for both of them. "You saved my life," he said as they sat before the fire, steam rising from their clothing. Frances shook her head. "You would have done the same for me." "Yes," he agreed, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I would." They sat in silence for a while, the storm continuing its assault outside. Frances was acutely aware of Elliot's presence beside her, of the way their shoulders almost touched beneath their blankets. "I should check on the horses," Elliot said eventually, making no move to rise. "They're fine in the barn," Frances replied. "The building's on higher ground." Another silence fell, more charged than before. When Elliot finally spoke, his voice was so low she had to lean closer to hear him. "I've never met anyone like you, Frances Donovan Jameson." The use of her full name startled her. "What do you mean?" "Most people see what they expect to see," he said, his gaze still on the fire. "They decide who you are before they know you, but you're like a book whose pages reveal new surprises with every turn." Frances felt a flush spread across her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire's heat. "I'm just an ordinary woman." Elliot turned to look at her then, his expression deadly serious. "There is nothing ordinary about you." The moment stretched between them, taut as a bowstring. Frances knew she should move away, should remember her place as a married woman, but something in Elliot's gaze held her captive. When his hand came up to brush a strand of damp hair from her face, she didn't pull away. When his fingers lingered against her cheek, she leaned into the touch. "This is wrong," she whispered, even as she tilted her face toward his. "I know," he replied, his breath warm against her lips. The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Frances knew she should stop it, knew her duty to Edwin, but the feelings Elliot awakened in her were too powerful to deny. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, becoming hungry and desperate. Reality intruded in the form of a particularly violent gust of wind that rattled the windows, startling them apart. Frances pulled back, horrified at her own weakness. "I can't," she said, rising abruptly. "Edwin has been nothing but good to me. I won't betray him like this." Elliot stood as well, his expression tortured. "I'm sorry, I should never have." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight." "Elliot, it's better this way," he interrupted. "Good night, Frances." Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. Frances sank back onto the chair, pressing her fingers to her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. She had never been unfaithful to Edwin in thought or deed until now. The realization filled her with shame. Yet beneath it lay something else, a desperate longing for the connection she had felt with Elliot, for the way he looked at her as if she were precious and complete, just as she was. The night passed in restless contemplation, with Frances alternating between regret and a guilty yearning for what might have been. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a clear sky and mud-soaked ground in its wake. When Elliot knocked at the kitchen door, his manner was formal and distant. "Creeks receded," he reported. "Some damage to the lower pasture fence, but nothing that can't be fixed. I'll get started on it today." "I'll have breakfast ready soon," Frances replied, equally formal. They fell into an uneasy routine over the next days, careful to maintain distance and speak only of necessary ranch matters. The kiss remained unmentioned, though Frances caught Elliot watching her sometimes when he thought she wouldn't notice. 2 days before Edwin was due to return, Frances was gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard a wagon approaching. Thinking it might be Edwin returning early, she hurried to the front of the house, only to find Widow Jenkins and her daughter Margaret climbing down from a buggy. "Mrs. Jameson," the older woman called, her voice falsely sweet. "We were just passing by and thought we'd check on you, what with Edwin away and all. It's not proper for a woman to be alone with a single man, even if he is just a ranch hand." Frances stiffened, hearing the insinuation clearly. "How thoughtful of you, Mrs. Jenkins. Won't you come in for tea?" As they settled in the parlor, Frances felt the women's scrutiny like a physical weight. Margaret, a pretty girl of 19 who had been married for a year without conceiving, looked at Frances with a mixture of pity and superiority that was hard to bear. "Edwin's due back tomorrow," Frances said, pouring tea for her unwelcome guests. "Is he now?" Widow Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "We heard in town it would be at least another week. Business in Phoenix taking longer than expected, they say." Frances frowned. "I haven't received any message to that effect." "Oh, perhaps it hasn't reached you yet," the widow said with exaggerated concern. "Isolated as you are out here. That's why we thought to check on you to make sure everything was proper." The implication hung in the air as Frances served cake with hands that trembled slightly. She had done nothing wrong other than that one kiss, yet guilt colored her cheeks, giving the women exactly the reaction they were looking for. "Where is that ranch hand?" Margaret asked, glancing around as if expecting to find Elliot hiding behind the curtains. "Mother says he's quite handsome." "Mr. Jakes is repairing fences damaged in the flood," Frances replied stiffly. "He's a very dedicated worker." "I'm sure he is," Widow Jenkins said with a knowing smile. "Young, strong men often are dedicated." The visit stretched interminably, with the women making one suggestive comment after another, while Frances struggled to maintain her composure. When they finally left, promising to look in on her again soon, Frances closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted by the effort of defending herself against unspoken accusations. Elliot found her still there when he came to the house for dinner, her face pale and drawn. "What happened?" he asked, concern overriding the distance he had maintained since the night of the storm. "Widow Jenkins and her daughter paid a visit," Frances said bitterly. "Apparently, the town thinks my reputation needs monitoring with Edwin away." Understanding dawned in Elliot's eyes. "I see." "They say Edwin's been delayed in Phoenix," Frances continued, "though I've received no word from him." Elliot's expression darkened. "The mail coach hasn't run since the storm. Roads are likely washed out." They stood in uncomfortable silence until Frances straightened, smoothing her apron with shaking hands. "I should finish preparing dinner." "Frances," Elliot said, his voice gentle. "What happened the other night, please," she interrupted. "Let's not speak of it. Edwin will be home soon, and we can all return to our proper places." A flash of hurt crossed Elliot's face before he nodded. "As you wish." That night, after a stilted dinner where they both ate little and spoke less, Frances sat alone in the parlor, staring at the unlit lamp and wondering how her life had become so complicated. The sound of a horse approaching broke her reverie, and she hurried to the window, expecting to see Edwin returning early. Instead, it was Elliot, mounting his horse in the fading light. She watched as he rode toward town, his back straight and his head high despite the obvious fatigue in his posture. The sight filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. Frances was awakened before dawn by the sound of horses and men's voices. She dressed quickly and hurried outside to find Edwin dismounting from his horse, while behind him, Elliot and several other men were unloading crates from a wagon. "Edwin," she called, relief and guilt mingling in her chest. "You're back early." He embraced her, smelling of dust and sweat from the road. Roads cleared faster than expected, decided to bring the new stock right away. He gestured to the men working. "Hired some help to drive the cattle. They'll be staying a few days while we get everything settled." Frances nodded, her gaze drawn to Elliot, who was carefully avoiding looking in their direction. "When did you meet up with Elliot?" "In town last night," Edwin replied. "Good thing. Two needed the extra hand with the cattle. He's a fine worker, that one." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as the new cattle were integrated into the herd, and the hired hands worked from dawn to dusk. Frances kept busy feeding the men and maintaining the house, grateful for the buffer their presence provided between her and Elliot. Edwin seemed changed by his trip to Phoenix, more animated and talkative than usual, full of plans for expanding the ranch further. He spoke of building a larger house, of perhaps hiring a permanent cook to help Frances when they entertained business associates. "We're on the verge of something big," he told her one night as they prepared for bed. "The territory's growing, and there's money to be made for those willing to take risks." Frances listened, trying to share his enthusiasm while part of her mind remained fixed on the memory of Elliot's kiss, on the way he had looked at her as if she were the most valuable thing in the world. A week after Edwin's return, as the hired hands were preparing to depart, Elliot approached them as they sat on the porch after dinner. "I wanted to thank you both," he said formally. "You've been more than fair employers." Frances felt her heart sink. "You're leaving?" Elliot nodded, his gaze directed more at Edwin than at her. "Got an offer from a ranch up north. Good opportunity." Edwin frowned. "I thought you were settled here. We've barely started the expansion." "It's time for me to move on," Elliot replied, his expression carefully neutral. "Been in one place too long already." Frances remained silent, feeling as if something precious was slipping through her fingers, but knowing she had no right to ask him to stay. Edwin, oblivious to the undercurrents, tried to persuade Elliot to reconsider, offering higher wages and more responsibility on the ranch. "I appreciate it," Elliot said finally, "but my mind's made up. I'll stay through the end of the week to help get those new cattle settled, then I'll be on my way." As he walked back to the bunkhouse, Frances felt Edwin's gaze on her. "Shame to lose him," he said. "Best hand we've had. Wonder what's really driving him away." Frances couldn't meet his eyes, afraid he would see the truth written on her face. The remaining days of Elliot's employment passed with agonizing slowness. Frances avoided being alone with him, ensuring that either Edwin or one of the remaining hired hands was always present when they interacted. If Edwin noticed her uncharacteristic behavior, he said nothing, too absorbed in his plans for the ranch's future. On Elliot's final evening, Edwin insisted on hosting a small farewell dinner. Frances prepared his favorite dishes, venison stew and apple pie, while trying to ignore the ache that had settled in her chest at the thought of his departure. During the meal, Edwin dominated the conversation with talk of cattle markets and land acquisition, while Frances pushed food around her plate, and Elliot contributed only when directly addressed. "Where will you go after the Northridge Ranch?" Edwin asked as they finished their pie. Elliot shrugged. "Not sure yet. Might head to California eventually. Always wanted to see the ocean." "Well, you always have a place here if you change your mind," Edwin said generously, raising his coffee cup in a toast. Later, as Frances washed the dishes, she sensed someone behind her and turned to find Elliot standing in the kitchen doorway, his hat in his hands. "Came to say goodbye," he said quietly. "Leaving at first light tomorrow." Frances set down the plate she'd been drying, her hands suddenly unsteady. "Safe travels then." "Frances," he began, then stopped, searching for words. "I want you to know that I never meant to." "Please don't," she interrupted, glancing toward the parlor where Edwin sat reading. "It's better this way." Elliot nodded, his blue eyes sad. "You deserve happiness," he said softly. "Remember that, whatever happens." Before she could respond, he had placed his hat on his head and walked out, the kitchen door closing quietly behind him. Frances stood motionless, a dish towel clutched in her hands, feeling as if something vital had been torn from her. Morning came with a heavy fog that shrouded the ranch in ghostly white. Frances rose early, unable to sleep, and watched from the bedroom window as Elliot loaded his few possessions onto his horse. She wanted to run outside, to beg him to stay, to tell him that in just a few short months he had awakened feelings in her that she hadn't known she possessed. Instead, she remained at the window, silent and unseen as he mounted and rode away, disappearing into the mist like a dream upon waking. Life returned to its previous rhythm after Elliot's departure, though Frances found herself going through the motions without the contentment she had once felt. Edwin, caught up in his expansion plans, didn't seem to notice her quieter demeanor or the way her smile rarely reached her eyes. As winter approached, bringing colder temperatures to Camp Verde, Frances received an unexpected invitation to join the town's Ladies' Aid Society. She initially suspected it was another opportunity for the women to mock her, but the invitation, delivered by the minister's wife, seemed genuine. "We need someone with your organizational skills," Mrs. Peterson explained. "We're preparing Christmas baskets for the less fortunate families, and no one can keep accounts like you can." Cautiously, Frances agreed to attend the next meeting. To her surprise, she was greeted with politeness, if not warmth, by the assembled women. As she helped sort donations and plan distribution routes, Frances began to understand that something had changed in the town's perception of her. It wasn't until the third meeting that Widow Jenkins, unusually subdued, approached her during the tea break. "Mrs. Jameson," she began, her usual sharpness absent, "I owe you an apology." Frances set down her teacup, stunned. "I beg your pardon." The older woman looked uncomfortable but continued. "My Margaret, she lost her baby last month, early like your own losses." She twisted her handkerchief between age-spotted hands. "She's been inconsolable, convinced she's failed as a woman. Made me realize how cruel we've been to you all these years." Frances didn't know how to respond. The pain of her own miscarriages had never truly faded, merely been buried beneath layers of resignation and shame. "I'm very sorry for your daughter's loss," she said finally. "Please tell her. Tell her it wasn't her fault. These things happen, and no amount of blame can change them." Widow Jenkins nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "That's what I've been trying to tell her. Thought perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, you might speak with her sometime. Woman to woman." The request, so unexpected after years of judgment, left Frances momentarily speechless. Finally, she nodded. "I would be happy to." As winter deepened, Frances found a new purpose in helping Margaret Jenkins come to terms with her loss. The younger woman's grief mirrored what Frances had experienced years earlier, and in offering comfort, she found a measure of healing for her own pain. Edwin, though supportive of her involvement with the Ladies' Aid Society, seemed increasingly distant, spending long days away from the ranch on business and returning late, often too tired for more than brief conversation before bed. One snowy evening in early December, as Frances sat by the fire mending one of Edwin's shirts, he joined her in the parlor with an unusually serious expression. "There's something we need to discuss," he said, settling into the chair opposite hers. Frances set aside her sewing, a sense of foreboding rising in her chest. "What is it?" Edwin leaned forward, hands clasped between his knees. "I've been offered a partnership in a large cattle operation in Wyoming territory. It would mean more money, more opportunities than we could ever have here." "Wyoming," Frances repeated, trying to imagine leaving the home they had built together. "When would we go?" A shadow crossed Edwin's face. "That's what I wanted to discuss. The position would require frequent travel, long hours, not suitable conditions for a wife." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're suggesting going without me, just initially," he assured her. "For a year or two until things are established. Then you could join me." Frances stared at him, trying to reconcile this proposal with the man she had known for 5 years. "You want me to stay here alone for years while you build a new life elsewhere?" "Not alone," Edwin said quickly. "I've spoken to your friend Margaret. She's willing to move in as your companion. Her husband travels frequently for work, so the arrangement would benefit you both." The careful planning behind his announcement told Frances that this was no sudden decision. "How long have you been considering this?" Edwin had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Several months. The opportunity arose during my trip to Phoenix." Frances thought of the expansion plans he had been so excited about, the new cattle, the talk of a bigger house. Had it all been a pretense while he prepared to leave? "I don't understand," she said slowly. "Our life here is good. The ranch is prospering." Edwin sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not about the money, Frances. It's about—" He hesitated. "I'm 43 years old. I had hoped for a family by now, children to carry on what I've built." The words struck Frances like a physical blow. Despite his kindness over the years, his patient acceptance of their childlessness, the truth finally emerged. She had failed him in the most fundamental way. "I see," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You're leaving because I couldn't give you children." "No, that's not," Edwin began, then stopped, his expression conflicted. "It's part of it, yes, but there's more. We've grown apart, Frances. We both know it. You've found purpose in town with your charity work, and I need something more than what we have here." Tears burned behind Frances's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "When would you leave?" "After Christmas," he replied. "I wanted to give you time to adjust to the idea." Frances nodded mechanically, her mind struggling to process this upheaval in what she had thought was a stable life. "And if I don't want to be left behind, if I want to come with you now?" Edwin's hesitation told her everything she needed to know. "The conditions would be very primitive initially. It wouldn't be comfortable for you." "I see," Frances repeated, rising from her chair. "If you'll excuse me, I need some air." Ignoring Edwin's call, she grabbed her shawl and stepped onto the porch, where the cold air stung her face and finally released the tears she had been holding back. 5 years of marriage, ending not with a dramatic betrayal but with a calm, practical discussion of separate futures. As she stood shivering in the winter night, Frances realized that the pain she felt was not for the loss of Edwin's love had they ever truly loved each other as more than comfortable companions, but for the future she had imagined they would share. And beneath that pain lay something unexpected: relief. Relief that the pretense was over, that the weight of her failure as a wife could finally be acknowledged openly rather than hanging unspoken between them. When she returned to the house, Edwin was waiting anxiously. "Frances, I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I still care for you deeply. This arrangement would give us both freedom to find happiness." Frances studied his face, the face of the man who had rescued her from poverty, who had been kind and patient, but who had never looked at her the way Elliot had, as if she were complete and perfect just as she was. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is unexpected." Edwin nodded, relieved that she wasn't hysterical or completely opposed. "Take all the time you need. Nothing needs to be decided tonight." But as Frances lay awake that night, listening to Edwin's steady breathing beside her, she knew that everything had already been decided. He would go to Wyoming, pursuing his dream of a legacy, and she would remain in Camp Verde, the barren wife left behind. The days leading up to Christmas passed in a fog for Frances. She went through the motions of preparation, baking cookies, decorating the small pine tree Edwin brought from the mountains, wrapping modest gifts for him and the few friends they had in town. Beneath the festive activities, The knowledge of Edwin's imminent departure colored every moment. They had reached an understanding of sorts. Edwin would leave as planned, while Frances would remain at the ranch with Margaret Jenkins as her companion. The property would continue to be managed by a capable foreman Edwin had hired, with profits divided between them. "It's not a divorce," Edwin had explained carefully. "Simply a separation that allows us both to pursue different paths." Frances had nodded, knowing that divorce carried a stigma neither of them wished to bear, especially in a small community like Camp Verde. This arrangement, unusual though it was, would preserve appearances while granting them both freedom. On Christmas Eve, as they sat beside the decorated tree, Edwin presented Frances with a small, wrapped package. "A parting gift," he said, his expression somber. Inside was a deed, transferring full ownership of the ranch house and surrounding 10 acres to Frances's name. "The rest of the property will continue as we discussed," Edwin explained. "But this ensures you'll always have a home, regardless of what happens in the future." Tears filled Frances's eyes at the unexpected generosity. Despite everything, Edwin was still trying to protect her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You've been a good wife, Frances," he said, taking her hand. "Better than I deserved in many ways. I hope someday you'll find the happiness that I couldn't give you." His words brought Elliot's face unbidden to her mind, his blue eyes, his rare smile, the way he had said, "You are wanted," with such conviction. Frances pushed the thought away, ashamed to be thinking of another man while sitting beside her husband. Edwin departed 2 days after Christmas, the wagon loaded with his personal belongings and supplies for the journey north. As Frances stood on the porch watching him drive away, she felt a curious mixture of sorrow and possibility, as if she were standing at a crossroads rather than an ending. Margaret Jenkins moved into the ranch house the following week, bringing an unexpected vitality to rooms that had grown too quiet. Her grief over her lost child had softened into a gentle melancholy that complemented Frances's own quiet nature, and the two women established a comfortable routine together. Winter gave way to spring, bringing new growth to the valley and a gradual healing to Frances's wounded spirit. Letters arrived occasionally from Edwin, describing his new life in Wyoming and expressing hope that she was well. Frances responded with news of Camp Verde and the ranch, their correspondence cordial but increasingly like that of distant relatives rather than husband and wife. Her position in the town had changed dramatically. Where once there had been mockery and judgment, now there was a tentative acceptance, even respect. The Ladies' Aid Society elected her treasurer, and she found herself invited to social gatherings where, for the first time, she was treated as an equal rather than an object of pity. Summer arrived with blazing heat that turned the surrounding hills golden. Frances was returning from town one sweltering afternoon when she spotted a rider approaching the ranch from the opposite direction. As the figure drew closer, her heart began to race, recognizing the straight-backed posture and the chestnut gelding even before she could make out his face. Elliot Jakes pulled his horse to a stop beside her wagon, removing his hat as he did so. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face more weathered, but his blue eyes were the same clear and direct as they met hers. "Frances," he said simply. "Elliot," she replied, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "What brings you back to Camp Verde?" He gestured vaguely toward the hills. "Passing through. Heard in town that Edwin had gone north. Wanted to make sure you were all right." Frances nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look, hair escaping from its pins, face flushed from the heat, dress dampened with perspiration. "I'm managing well enough." An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Elliot replaced his hat, shading his eyes from the relentless sun. "I should let you get out of this heat," he said. "Just wanted to pay my respects." "Would you care for some lemonade?" Francis asked impulsively. "Margaret, my companion, made a fresh pitcher this morning." Elliot hesitated, then nodded. "That would be welcome. Thank you." They rode in silence to the ranch house, where Margaret greeted Elliot with friendly curiosity before excusing herself to visit a neighbor, leaving them alone with their lemonade on the shaded porch. "How long will you be in Camp Verde?" Francis asked, striving for a casual tone. "Not sure," Elliot replied. "Haven't decided where I'm heading next." Francis studied him over the rim of her glass. "And the ranch up north didn't work out." A shadow crossed his face. "It did for a time." "Then didn't." His reticence told Francis there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Instead, she found herself describing the changes in her own life: Edwin's departure, her new status in town, the freedom she had discovered in managing her own affairs. "You seem content," Elliot observed, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I am, mostly," she admitted. "It's not the life I expected, but there's a certain peace in it." Elliot set down his empty glass. "I should go, don't want to impose." "You're not imposing," Francis said quickly. "In fact." She hesitated, then continued. "The ranch foreman mentioned needing additional help with the summer roundup if you're looking for work." Hope flickered briefly in Elliot's eyes before he shook his head. "Probably not wise, given our history." Francis felt a flush creep up her neck. "Of course, I understand." As Elliot rose to leave, Francis found herself unwilling to let him go so easily. "What happened, Elliot? Why did you really leave last year?" He paused at the porch steps, his back to her. "You know why." "Tell me anyway," she insisted. Elliot turned, his expression pained. "Because I fell in love with my employer's wife. Because every day I spent near you made it harder to remember my place. Because I respected Edwin too much to betray him and you too much to ask you to." The raw honesty of his words left Francis breathless. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now?" Elliot's laugh held no humor. "Now I find out you're alone, that Edwin's gone north to start a new life without you, and I'm right back where I started, wanting what I have no right to claim." Francis rose from her chair, moving toward him with deliberate steps. "Edwin and I have an understanding," she said carefully. "Our marriage exists on paper, but we've both agreed to pursue our separate paths." Elliot's eyes widened slightly. "What are you saying, Francis?" "I'm saying," she replied, coming to stand before him, "that I'm not Edwin's wife in any way that matters anymore. I'm saying that I've thought of you every day since you rode away. I'm saying that the only time I felt truly wanted, truly seen, was when you looked at me." For a moment, Elliot remained frozen, disbelief warring with hope in his expression. Then, with agonizing slowness, he reached out to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I never stopped loving you," he confessed. "Tried to, God knows. Rode as far as California, worked until I was too exhausted to think. But you were always there in my mind." Francis covered his hand with her own, turning her face to press a kiss against his palm. "Stay," she whispered. "Not as a ranch hand, not as a visitor, stay with me." The sun was setting when Margaret returned, casting long shadows across the yard as Elliot helped Francis prepare dinner in the kitchen, their movements around each other as natural as if they had been cooking together for years. Margaret took one look at their faces and smiled knowingly before announcing she would be visiting her sister in Prescott for a week or two. "Seems like you'll have company enough without me underfoot," she said to Francis with a wink that brought a blush to her cheeks. That night, after Margaret had retired to her room to pack for her journey, Francis and Elliot sat on the porch beneath a canopy of stars, their hands intertwined. "What will people say?" Elliot asked, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The town hasn't always been kind to you." Frances smiled, surprising herself with how little she cared about Camp Verde's opinion. "They'll talk, of course. They always do, but it doesn't matter anymore. And Edwin," Elliot's voice held concern rather than jealousy, "he was good to both of us." "Edwin made his choice," Frances said simply. "He's building a new life in Wyoming, one that didn't include me. His last letter mentioned a widow he'd met, the mother of 2 young boys. He sounded happy." Elliot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Still, we should wait a while. Give time for people to adjust to your separation before we—" Frances pressed her fingers against his lips, silencing him. "I've spent 5 years living according to what others thought was proper, what they thought I should be. I won't waste another day." The conviction in her voice made Elliot smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've changed, Frances Donovan." "Yes," she agreed. "I have." In the weeks that followed, Camp Verde buzzed with gossip about the scandalous arrangement at the Jameson Ranch. Some, like Widow Jenkins, defended Frances, pointing out that Edwin had abandoned her, not the other way around. Others were less forgiving, particularly when it became clear that Elliot had taken up permanent residence in the house. Frances weathered the storm with newfound strength, attending church with her head held high, and continuing her work with the Ladies' Aid Society, despite whispered comments and disapproving glances. Elliot, for his part, worked tirelessly to improve the ranch, winning grudging respect from the foreman and other hands with his knowledge and work ethic. By harvest time, the worst of the gossip had died down, replaced by newer scandals and concerns. Frances and Elliot settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet evenings, their love deepening with each passing day. In late October, a letter arrived from Edwin, responding to Frances's careful explanation of her new circumstances. To her surprise, it contained not condemnation but understanding. "I've no right to judge your choices when I was the one who left," he wrote. "Elliot Jakes is a good man, better perhaps than I was to you. I wish you both happiness." Enclosed was a legal document transferring full ownership of the entire ranch to Frances, with a note explaining that he had found success in Wyoming and had no need of the Camp Verde property. It was, in its way, a final gift, freedom from the last ties that bound her to her past. The first winter storm arrived in early December, bringing swirling snow that transformed the ranch into a wonderland of white. Frances stood at the bedroom window, watching Elliot make his way back from the barn, his tall figure leaning into the wind. Her hand drifted unconsciously to her abdomen, where the faintest thickening had begun to show. She hadn't told him yet, afraid to hope too strongly after her previous losses, but the morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks and the confirmation from the town's doctor left little doubt. When Elliot entered the bedroom, stomping snow from his boots and rubbing his hands together for warmth, Frances turned to him with a smile that held both joy and trepidation. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Elliot crossed to her, concern immediately replacing his smile. "What is it? Are you unwell?" Frances took his cold hands in hers, guiding them to rest against her stomach. "Not unwell," she whispered. "Just expecting." For a moment, Elliot stood motionless, his expression blank with shock. Then, as understanding dawned, his face transformed with a joy so pure it brought tears to Frances's eyes. "A baby," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby," Frances nodded, her own joy mingled with lingering fear. "The doctor says I'm about 3 months along." "But Elliot, I've lost babies before." "There's no guarantee," he silenced her with a gentle kiss, then knelt before her, his hands still cradling her belly. "This one will be different," he said with quiet conviction. "This one is born of love from the very beginning. As Frances looked down at Elliot's bowed head, at the reverence with which he touched her, she felt a certainty that matched his own. This child, created in love rather than duty, would thrive where others had not. "What will we tell people?" she asked, thinking of Camp Verde's reaction to an unwed mother, even one technically still married to another man. Elliot stood, taking her hands in his. "We tell them the truth that we love each other, that we're building a life together, that this child is wanted more than anything in the world." "Wanted," Frances repeated, the word carrying all the healing power it had the first time Elliot had said it to her. "Yes, this baby is wanted, as am I." "As you have always been," Elliot assured her, drawing her into his arms. "From the moment I first saw you, standing so bravely in that mercantile while the town whispered behind your back. You were wanted then, you are wanted now, and you will be wanted every day for the rest of our lives." Spring arrived with gentle rains that turned the valley a vibrant green. Frances sat on the porch, her sewing forgotten in her lap as she watched Elliot work in the garden they had planted together. Her belly was round and full now, the baby active within her, kicking and rolling as if eager to join the world. The town's attitude had gradually softened as her pregnancy progressed. Whatever judgment remained was countered by genuine goodwill from those who had witnessed Frances's quiet dignity throughout her trials. Widow Jenkins had become an unexpected ally, organizing a group of women to prepare baby clothes and blankets, insisting that every child deserved a proper welcome regardless of circumstances. "Beautiful day," Elliot said, looking up from his work to find Frances watching him. "How are you feeling?" "Enormous," she replied with a laugh. "And impatient. Dr. Miller says it could be any day now." Elliot set down his tools and came to join her on the porch, sitting on the step below her so she could rest her hands on his shoulders. "Nervous?" he asked. "A little," Frances admitted. "But mostly excited. I never thought I'd have this chance again." He turned to press a kiss to her palm. "You'll be a wonderful mother." As twilight fell, they remained on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Frances felt a sense of completion, of rightness, that she had never known before. Whatever judgment the world might pass on their unconventional family, she knew they had found their way to where they were meant to be. The baby arrived 3 days later, a healthy boy with Elliot's blue eyes, and a powerful set of lungs that announced his arrival to the world with impressive vigor. As Frances held him to her breast for the first time, tears of joy streaming down her face, she looked up to find Elliot watching them with an expression of awe. "He's perfect," Elliot whispered, gently touching the tiny fingers that curled reflexively around his own. "Yes," Frances agreed. "He is." They named him Samuel, heard by God, a testament to prayers answered after years of silence. As news of his birth spread through Camp Verde, visitors began to arrive bearing gifts and congratulations. Even those who had been most critical seemed softened by the sight of the healthy baby and the obvious devotion of his parents. By Samuel's first birthday, Frances was pregnant again, this time with far less fear and far more confidence in her body's ability to nurture new life. Their daughter, Elizabeth, arrived in the autumn, as fiery and determined as her brother was contemplative and calm. Life at the ranch fell into a pattern of hard work and simple joys. Elliot managed the cattle operation with skill, gradually expanding their holdings and reputation. Frances, finding unexpected fulfillment in motherhood, also continued her work with various town charities, her status in Camp Verde evolving from outcast to respected community member. Edwin's letters came less frequently as the years passed, though each brought news of his growing family in Wyoming and good wishes for Frances and her children. The legal dissolution of their marriage was finally arranged when Samuel was 3, allowing Francis and Elliot to marry in a quiet ceremony witnessed by their closest friends. "Never thought I'd see the day," Widow Jenkins remarked at the small reception afterward, patting Francis's hand. "You deserve this happiness, my dear. Both of you do." As Francis looked around at the gathering, at her husband of heart, now husband-in-law, at their children playing in the yard, at the friends who had supported them through judgment and gossip, she felt a profound gratitude for the twisted path that had led her here. 10 years to the day after Elliot had first walked into the Camp Verde mercantile, he and Francis sat on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching their 4 children chase fireflies in the summer twilight. Samuel, now 9, led his siblings in elaborate games of his own invention, his natural leadership already evident. Elizabeth, 8, matched him in determination if not in height, while the twins, James and Rebecca, 6 years old and inseparable, followed wherever their older siblings led. "Did you ever imagine this?" Francis asked, leaning against Elliot's shoulder. "That day when we first met," Elliot smiled, wrapping his arm around her. "Not specifically, but I knew you were extraordinary, knew at the moment I saw you holding your head high despite those gossips." Francis thought back to the woman she had been then, wounded by loss, diminished by judgment, defined by what she lacked rather than what she offered. "I was so lost," she murmured. "Not lost," Elliot corrected gently. "Just waiting to be found." As darkness fell completely and the children were called in for bedtime, Francis and Elliot remained on the porch, counting stars as they had on so many nights before. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and peaceful, a testament to what they had built together. "You know what today is?" Elliot asked, his voice thoughtful. Francis nodded. 10 years since you rode into Camp Verde and changed my life." "Changed mine too," he said. "I was drifting, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. You gave me a home, Francis, a place to belong." "We gave each other what we needed most," she replied. "You saw value in me when everyone else saw only what I couldn't do. You wanted me when I thought I was unwanted." Elliot turned to her, the love in his eyes as clear and strong as it had been from the beginning. "I still want you," he said softly. "Every day, a little more than the day before." As Francis leaned in to kiss her husband beneath the vast Arizona sky, she thought of all the whispers that had once followed her through Camp Verde, all the judgments that had nearly broken her spirit. How strange that those very things had led her here, to this man, this family, this life filled with more love than she had ever dared to imagine. The town had mocked her for being barren and unwanted. But Elliot Jakes had seen beyond her supposed failings to the woman beneath, had valued her for exactly who she was, had given her the greatest gift anyone could offer, the knowledge that she was wanted, completely and unconditionally, for herself alone. And in the end, that had made all the difference.